This almond milk is amazing. Hello world, welcome back to another video. Today I will be chatting about all the books that I read in December, and like I mentioned in my previous video, there is a lot of them. So about halfway through October I started to realize that if I wanted to finish my Goodreads challenge as well as the ABC Reading Bingo, I had to get a move on. And I tried, I really did. I went through my TBR list on Goodreads, I selected books that I thought were fitting for the bingo prompts, and in my mind, I was really working hard to get there. Obviously, I am a major procrastinator and I didn't really get a move on until the beginning of December probably. By that time, I was really feeling the pressure. I figured I could still do it if I spent my time wisely, which I obviously didn't end up doing because procrastination. I need to take a sip before I spill it. Anyway, I read 14 books in December, and to be fair, a lot of them are quite a bit thinner than what I usually read, but on the other hand, a lot of them are also books that had been on my TBR for a very long time, and just because they're thin doesn't necessarily mean they're easy. So even though this whole month of December was kind of a mad dash to the finish line, there's really only one book in this wrap-up that was kind of a cheat that I only read as a filler. The first book I want to talk about is one that I carried over from November, and that is Sophie's World by Jostein Gaarder. I read this book because it was first published in the year I was born, which is one of the prompts on the ABC Reading Bingo. I feel like this is one of those books that everyone sort of knows, but very few people have actually read it cover to cover. This is a book about philosophy wrapped into a story about a girl named Sophie, wrapped into a story about a girl named Hilde. I'm not super enthusiastic about this book. I didn't hate it, but for me, the contrast between the dry, kind of textbook-ish style of the philosophy bits and the surrealist story of Sophie was just too big, and one was constantly taking away from the other, and I ended up not really getting into either of them. I then read The Story of a Shipwrecked Sailor by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which is the story of a sailor who is not actually shipwrecked but washed overboard. This is actually a real story. It actually happened, and the guy survived for 10 days on a raft without any food or drink before finally reaching land again. I read this for the book set on a different continent square on the bingo, which is kind of funny because it's set at sea, but it's the Caribbean, so it's a different continent. This book kind of reminded me of Life of Pi, but obviously it's a lot shorter and there is no tiger involved. The next book is also a sea story. It's The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. I read this because it's one of my father's favorite books, which is also one of the prompts on the ABC Reading Bingo. As I'm sure we all know, even I knew this before reading it, it's about an old man who's a fisherman and he hasn't had a good catch in a while, and then when he finally catches the biggest fish of his life after days of struggle, most of it gets eaten by sharks before he reaches port again. I tried to read some Hemingway before and I really hated it, to be honest, so I wasn't really looking forward to this one, but I actually really enjoyed this. I love the tone of the story, I love the affection and the respect between the old man and the boy. I love how respectful everyone is of the fisherman when he returns, even though he's kind of failed. And I also love how Hemingway has told such a complete story in such a tiny book. I also read this version of Hansel and Gretel by Neil Gaiman with illustrations by Lorenzo Mattotti. This book had been on my to-buy shelf at work for ages, and I finally decided to just get it, you know, treat yourself. The story is very close to the original fairy tale, so it's not that spectacular, although obviously it's Neil Gaiman, so it's awesome writing. But the thing that really stands out about this book is the illustrations. They are absolutely amazing. They reminded me a little bit of Jim Kay's illustrations for A Monster Calls, in that it seems kind of windswept, if you know what I mean. I hope you can see this. It's all black and white and they're all quite dark, so I don't know how well this shows up on camera. It's not a style that I would have thought I had very strong feelings about, but it's very evocative. Next, I read Almost Midnight by Rainbow Rowell, which is a collection of 2 short stories which both have been published before but never together. I read this because one of the bingo prompts is to read something by an author who shares your name, and iris means rainbow. The first story is about a boy and a girl and their friendship and feelings towards each other over the course of several New Year's Eves. The second story is about a girl who wants to camp out in line for the new Star Wars, but when she gets there it turns out there's only 2 other people there. I loved this little book. Rainbow Rowell is really good at writing chemistry and cuteness, and I really recommend this book as a quick in-between read. I then read Lord of the Flies by William Golding. I read this as a banned book because it's been banned a lot, especially in schools over the years. It's about a group of boys who somehow get stranded on an island, and it's about the sort of society they try to create for themselves. There's no structure, there's no cooperation, there's too much competition and pride and toxic masculinity, and in the end it gets really bad. This book is a classic, obviously, and I'm glad to finally have read it, even though I didn't love it. It wasn't bad, and I can definitely see how it's one of those books that gives you something new every time you reread it, but I'm not really planning on rereading it. Book number 7 is The Rules of Magic by Alice Hoffman. This is a relatively new release, and it's a prequel to Practical Magic, which has also been turned into a film with Sandra Bullock and Nicole Kidman, and I think most people know that. This book is about Jet and Franny, who are the aunts from the original story, and their brother Vincent. It's about them growing up in New York and learning about their heritage and their magic and basically everything their family goes through before they end up being the aunts in the house. I read Practical Magic quite a long time ago, but I do watch the film every once in a while. I was very excited about this book, and it definitely delivered. It has a really nice flow that made me just want to keep on going. I really couldn't put it down. I really like the way that magic is described in this book. It's not flashy, but the focus is really on nature and animals and salt and herbs and flowers. It's such an ingrained part of reality, and I really like that. Next, I read The Worm and the Bird by Coralie Bigford Smith, who also wrote The Fox and the Star, which I haven't read but really want to now. This book is about a bird and a worm, and it's kind of a snapshot of a key moment. It's mostly a visual book, and it's absolutely stunning. I love the illustrations. I love the autumn colors, and I love the sort of shiny metallic foiling bits. I do feel like some pieces were used more than once. That's not horrible or anything, but it does feel a bit like cheating in a book that is so visual. Maybe it's just me, maybe they weren't actually reused, and I don't know. I also read More Weird Things Customers Say in Bookshops by Jen Campbell. I had read part 1 before, but I realized that even though I have this book, and Jen actually signed it for me when we met at ABC in November, I never actually read it. Like the other one, this is a collection of strange and funny and unexpected things that people say to booksellers. As with the other one, I think this is particularly funny for me because I work in a bookshop as well, so a lot of it is very relatable, but if you don't, or if you work in another branch of retail, I think this is also it can be just as enjoyable because it's a really fun book. I then read The Day the World Came to Town by Jim DeFede. This is one of those books that had been on my radar for a very long time, and for some reason I just didn't pick it up until now. It's the story of how during 9/11, when the US airspace got closed, a lot of airplanes were actually on their way to the US, and they were flying over the ocean and they had to go somewhere. So a lot of them were rerouted to Canada, and a bunch of them got sent to Gander in Newfoundland. Gander is a really tiny place, so the population pretty much doubled with the amount of people that came off the planes. I didn't think the writing of this book was particularly good. It felt very formulaic, a lot of cliches, a lot of things that might have worked better in a spoken documentary instead of written down in a book. But I didn't read this book for the amazing prose, I read it for the story, and even though the storyteller is maybe not the best in the world, the story itself is still pretty great. It really shows the kindness and the humanity and the generosity of these tiny Newfie communities who really stepped up. Next, I finished The Sun Is Also a Star by Nicola Yoon. I read Everything Everything by Nicola Yoon quite some time ago, but I didn't really feel the push to pick this one up as well, even though I really enjoyed Everything Everything. This book is about two young people, Natasha, who is an undocumented Jamaican immigrant who's being deported with her family, and Daniel, who is a Korean-American boy who is really trying to figure out what he wants in life rather than what his parents want for him. They have this kind of whirlwind romance on Natasha's last day in the US, but obviously her being deported hangs over their heads the whole time. It's a really beautiful story, it's really touching. I love how the ending is not overly dramatic, but it's definitely also not sugar-coated, it's very real. I really enjoyed this book, and I think I actually preferred it over Everything Everything. Then I read The Gifts of Reading by Robert Macfarlane. This is the one kind of Hail Mary book that I was talking about. I don't even have a physical copy because I read it at work. It's a really thin little booklet, kind of an essay. It's about reading and traveling and giving books as gifts and the impact that that can have. It's a nice read, didn't rock my world, mostly because a lot of the books that were mentioned are not books that I'm familiar with, but the love for reading is very clear and I enjoyed that. I finally finished Ghostly by Audrey Niffenegger, which I actually started back in November. I read this book for the Book That Scares You square on the ABC Reading Bingo, not only because it's a book of ghost stories, but also because it's quite a big book that I'd been putting off for a long time, and by a long time I mean like a year and a half. So this is a collection of ghost stories. Some of them are quite old and well known, there's some classics in here, and some of them are very modern. My favourite from this collection is a story by Neil Gaiman called Click Clack the Rattle Bag. It's very short, and the ending, the last sentence just kind of sneaks up on you. That one genuinely scared me. All in all though, there weren't that many stories that I really enjoyed. It's not really my thing, although the cover is beautiful. Finally, I read The Time Traveler's Wife, also by Audrey Niffenegger, which is one of my favourite books of all time. The reason that I reread it, besides the fact that I still needed a book with time travel to complete my ABC Reading Bingo, is that I made a plan to, from now on, end every year on a reread and start the new year with a reread. I love rereading, but there are so many new exciting books that I haven't read out there as well, and usually I simply don't allow myself the time. The Time Traveler's Wife is about Claire and Henry. Henry has a genetic condition which causes him to travel through time. When Henry meets Claire for the first time, he's 28 and she's 20, but when Claire meets Henry for the first time, she's 6 and he's in his 30s. This makes it sound way more complicated than it actually is when you read the story and everything makes sense, but basically it's about this overwhelming love between two people and the obstacles they have to overcome. This has been one of my favorite books for a very long time, and I hadn't reread it in a while, so it was really good. So with that, I completed both my Goodreads goal of 75 books and my ABC Reading Bingo, but I'll make a separate video about that because I have a lot of thoughts on that. I hope you had a good reading month in December as well. If there's anything you would like to know about the books that I mentioned in this video, please feel free to leave a comment down below. If you have any recommendations for me based on the books that I talked about, definitely also let me know. I'm always looking for recommendations. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you again next time. Bye!